All right, guys, how you doing? I am Dr. Kevin Jennings, and I'm going to do a lecture for you, a whole series of lectures on human rights. Now, human rights is a very difficult topic a lot of times. In this course, we're going to talk a lot about very difficult things, very sad, depressing, emotionally disturbing things. So if you need to, pause these videos and go and do something else and come back after a while, that is totally allowed and encouraged. But here we go. So human rights is, it's kind of weirdly not really its own field of study. Lots of other different fields of study all kind of look at human rights, different pieces of it, different ways of looking at it. My own field, criminal justice, obviously will look at human rights as crimes, especially crimes against humanity. But then there's philosophy, which looks at, what does it mean to, what does that phrase mean? What are human rights? Sociology, anthropology, history, lots of different fields kind of touch on pieces of this human rights umbrella, but nobody really does it all, right? So it's a little difficult to talk about human rights when, as an academic, you're so focused in one area, and that area doesn't tend to encompass all of human rights. There's human rights in the abstract and human rights in the real world, right? It's one thing to talk about what people should have as human rights, how people should be treated by their governments, how people should, what they should expect from their life. And very different conversation to say, okay, now how does that happen in the real world? How do we get countries to cooperate? How do we deal with refugees? How do we end genocides? Things like that. They're obviously very related, but they can be very, very different at the same time, because it's one thing to talk about things in the abstract and a completely different thing to talk about how it applies in the real world. Hopefully, over this course, we'll be able to talk about both. The abstract, what are human rights, what do people deserve, and also the real world, how do we make sure they get that, what government agencies or intergovernment agencies or non-government agencies can we look to help support that, etc., etc. Especially in the United States, but throughout most of the academic world, the study of human rights really has a Western focus. And we'll talk more about what this means later, but it essentially means that the ideas about human rights that we tend to focus on are those coming from a Western tradition, which means everything up from the Greek through the Roman, English, French, to American. It's those ideas, those philosophies, those bases for how we look at the world, how we look at society, how we look at human interaction, that really informs how we look at human rights. It's something I'm conscious of. It's something you should be conscious of. But unfortunately, this course, because it's linked to the academic side of human rights, is also going to have that same Western focus. So be aware of it. Be aware that I'm going to do my best to try to bring in some non-Western ideas, some non-Western perspectives. This course is still mostly focused on Western thought and Western feelings about human rights. We need to also make a distinction here between society and the state. Okay, and I don't mean the state like we mean like we use the word in the United States. Here in the United States, a state is a subdivision within our country, right? There's 50 of them. Alabama, Georgia, Washington, Massachusetts, you can go off and name all 50 if you want. I remember I had to in the 4th grade. I bet I could still do it. But when I use the word the state in this course, I use that to mean what it means in the rest of the English-speaking world, which essentially means the country, the government, right? So when I mention the American state, I mean the federal government. I mean the United States government. When I mention, the state in England, I mean the English government. Okay? And that's different than society. We've really grown into this thing where society and country are synonymous. And that's a relatively modern thing, and it's not necessarily the case. So we think of being an American. Our society is American society. But you can have subdivisions of society within a country, i.e., the Southern society is very different from the Midwestern society, which is very different from the West Coast society here in the United States. On the other hand, you can also have a society that's larger than a nation state, right? So the Kurds in the Middle East are a great example. After World War II, the Allies got together and kind of drew relatively arbitrary lines in the desert part of the Middle East and said, okay, you're Iraq now, you're Iran, you're Jordan, you're Israel, you're all these different countries. And they took a lot of pre-established societies and split them up between countries. So the Kurds are a great example. They're a huge society, a huge group of people, but they got kind of split up between 3 or 4 different countries. And in none of those 3 or 4 different countries are they the majority. So they've seen a lot of human rights abuses as a minority in each one of these countries, but they're really one society that's spread out over 3 or 4 different countries. So, again, we're going to talk a lot about this later. This is just kind of the beginnings of this conversation, but there are really 3 generations of kind of subdivisions of human rights. So the ones we've been talking about for a long time, going back to the ancient Greeks, but really focusing on in the Enlightenment, were the civil and political rights. Right to free speech, right to assembly, right to, all these very basic civil and political rights that most of us in the first world, whether Western or Eastern, enjoy today, although not all of us. Then there's the second generation rights, which we're just kind of starting to realize and starting to focus on and really getting into law. So these are economic, social, and cultural rights, i.e. I have the right to a decent paying job. I have the right to not be discriminated against, not just by my government, but also by my fellow society members, right? I'm protected from discrimination based on who I am, not just from my government and the police force, but also from the business I go to, the restaurants, the hotels, things like that. And those are very new and incoming in the legal realm. And then finally, there's the third generation rights. These are the ones that were just, these are the ones that are even in the abstract relatively new, not just in the real world, but also in the abstract relatively new. Collective rights and environmental rights, i.e. my group, my Native American tribe has the right to not have a oil pipeline going through our land. I have the right to not have to breathe polluted air, things like that, okay? So, the first thing we have to discuss when it comes to human rights is we have to look at violations of human rights and think about those violations. What makes them violations? Why did they happen? How did they happen? All those things, right? So there are 5 observations we can make fairly universally about violations of human rights, and that leads to really 5 questions about what human rights really are, right? So the first, we observe that human rights violations are carried out by individuals, right? I'm sure I'm going to be using this as an example a lot in this class, but the Nazi Holocaust, right? The soldiers who actually did all those horrible things to the Jewish people and the Romani and the homosexuals and the socialists and all those people that got put into concentration camps, the soldiers that did all those really horrible things were people. So what makes a person willing and able to do these things against their fellow human beings? Like, how does one get to the point where they're okay with participating in this genocide of an entire people? And to answer that question, we have to look at theories of human nature. And there are a lot of these, and they're not necessarily opposed to one another. So I'm going to, about to describe a few of these, and they're not necessarily contradictory. They're just looking at the answers or potential answers from different perspectives. And they might arrive at the same answer from two completely different perspectives, or they might arrive at two completely different conclusions from very similar perspectives. But there's a lot of overlap on these and a lot of non-overlap. So when we're talking about human nature, one of the first debates is whether the whole nature or nurture thing. Are people born the way they're going to be when they grow up? I.e., is your personality, is your ability to do violence, is your morality, is your lots of those things innate in you? Or is it something that you gain through the growing up and socialization and maturation process, right? So in philosophy, they call this the essentialists versus the constructivists. What makes you you? And were you born with that, or were you kind of given that and developed that over the course of your life? A guy who we're going to be talking a lot about in this class was Hobbes, not the tiger from Calvin and Hobbes, but this guy. I actually got you a picture of him. He looks kind of creepy and weird, but read more about him and you'll absolutely guarantee that he's kind of creepy and weird. But Hobbes comes along and he says basically, look, humans are inherently violent. They're inherently in this constant state of warfare with each other. They want to take that other person's property because they want that property. They want to take that other person's, another man's wife because he's more beautiful than my wife. All these things. And so humans are in this constant state of conflict. And society is what we created as humans to restrain those urges. We all agreed to give up our freedom to be in this state of warfare. We've given up our ability to take other people's property. We've given up our ability to, assault and murder people, which we inherently want to do, because it results in a better long-term result. Our society, where we've given up these abilities, allows us to have better lives and more fulfilling lives and longer lives. Okay. There's behaviorism, which basically says that people act in response to stimuli, right? So something happens to you, you're going to react to it. What those stimuluses have been in your previous life have kind of trained you to react in certain ways. So if we know what all those stimuli were and how you reacted to them before, we can give you a new stimulus and we'll know how you react to it now. And it's those repeated stimuli all throughout your life that kind of dictate who you are and how you act and what your ethics are and your morals are and your mood and your personality and all those things. Then there's phenomenology, which essentially says it's not just stimuli response. It's that people take an active role in constructing their worldview, right? People consciously or subconsciously can go out and construct. They can choose how they see the world and how they react to the world and how they respond to certain situations. So it's not just, I give you this stimuli, you're going to react this way. It's, I give you this stimuli, you get to choose how to incorporate that into your worldview and then respond. So just because you've done these stimuli, you've had a certain response to a certain stimuli before, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have that certain stimuli again if you choose to change your worldview and have constructed your worldview in a different way since that last time I gave you that stimulus and you had that response. Okay? Second observation. Human rights violations, if you want to understand them, you have to understand their context, right? You have to understand the situation in which they happened, the group of people, the historical events that led up to it, the media surrounding the event, all those things. You have to understand that if you're going to understand how that human rights violations occurred and why it occurred, right? So our second question is, how did those conditions arise? And to answer that question, we have to look at theories of society, right? Once we have a society, what does that society look like? How does that society grow and change? Does it stay the same all the time? Does it change? What's the most important factors to look at in a society to examine why it was, why this human rights violation happened? So there's kind of two groups of theories about why or how society works. Okay, there's consensus theories, which essentially means society is pieces, they work together to create this society, and then we live in it, and we change a piece, and that piece changes the whole, and all those things. So within that, there's not a complete list, obviously, but there's functionalism and structuralism. Functionalism says basically just society is this collection of interrelated parts, right? So there's our justice system and our media and our politics and our technology and our, all these different pieces, and they all kind of work together and influence each other, and sometimes they come into conflict, but sometimes not, and those, those different pieces work together in different ways and influence each other, right? Then there's structuralism. Structuralism is really concerned with what is the background meaning of these things that happen, these pieces of society, these different factors of society. Why? What's the background of that? Why? What's the point? What's the underlying thing that is not necessarily obvious from the surface? And I remember back when I was taking an anthropology class, way back in the good old days of probably 2004, 2005. I took this great class, and the professor told us about, I don't even remember where in the world it was, but there was some, primitive, and I use that in the anthropological, old school 1900s sense, this primitive society where they grew this certain crop. I can't remember, it was yams or something. And every year after the yam harvest, they would sacrifice a bunch of the yams to their gods. And the anthropologists who first studied this culture were like, why do they do this? It seems so stupid. They're wasting all this food. Like, why? Why would you do that? It seems like such an inefficient, it's just a waste. But what they later found out was in the years of drought or the years of problem or strife or whatever, they couldn't grow enough food. Guess who got much less food? The gods did. That way the humans still had plenty to eat. So even in years of drought or years of warfare, years of sickness or whatever, even if they only grew half as much as they usually do, the humans could all still eat. So that was the underlying background reason for why they did what they did. Does that make sense? But in addition to the consensus theories, there are also conflict theories, which essentially say that societies are just arenas for conflict, right? They're just one more way in which humans are in this state of conflict. It's kind of up a level from what Hobbes would say, right? Instead of, individuals being in conflict, now it's groups being in conflict, right? And it's done through society, not through individual confrontation, right? Now, there's Karl Marx. I'm sure we've all heard lots of things about Karl Marx. He was America's big boogeyman for the last 100 years. And Marx comes along and he says, look, it's not about, society isn't, driven by consensus. It's not driven by people cooperating together. It's driven by class conflict. There's the rich and there's the poor. And the rich have this power, and they use society, everything from the media to the political realm to the economic realm, all these things, they use all of that in order to maintain that power. And it's the poor that we really should be focusing on. It's the middle class we really should be focusing on. Those are the people who perform the labor and do the things and make the widgets and buy the widgets, and they're so much of the economy, and yet it's the rich, the upper level, that gets all the benefit of it. And they are the ones that get to wield all the power and influence all the other areas of society. But it's this conflict between rich and poor that really kind of defines society. Then along comes this guy named Weber, who also apparently likes to take photos and reacts yeah, what's up kind of way. Because that's Marx there and Weber there. And he says, well, I mean, kind of, but it's not just class. It's class, status, and party, right? So it's not just economic power. It's social power and political power, right? So not only am I middle class, but I'm also, say, white and political power. I vote for X party, right? So it's not just conflict between rich and poor. It's conflict between the haves and the have-nots in multiple different fields, not just class, but also social status, where we have to look at gender, we have to look at race, we have to look at religion, we have to look at all kinds of things. And political, i.e. who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote, who are we voting for, how are we voting, all of these political things, right? And then, of course, along comes feminism, which, really hard to define when feminism started. You can look at feminist or people that we would in the modern day recognize as feminist icons all the way back through history. But it really became kind of formalized at the beginning of the 20th century and really became a much bigger movement, again, at least in the Western world, roughly around the beginning of the 20th century. And this feminist movement comes along and says, look, we have to look at society as an arena for conflict, but between men and women, the haves and the have-nots, which men and women very, if you ignore marriage and what people can gain through marriage, men and women, there's a lot of overlap there between class and status. There's a lot. I want to say that of all the female billionaires in the world, either all of them or almost all of them inherited their money. So they're either the daughter of someone rich or they were the wife of someone rich. And it's very, very difficult for women to transition classes other than with marriage or being lucky enough to be born to a rich parents. So, next thing we got to look at, or the next observation we can make, is that human rights violations are always condemned by the civilized groups. And again, I'm using that word civilized in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way. But why? Why do so many people, why are we able to look at this act and say, that's bad? Right? Why is so much of humanity able to look at this thing happening and say, that shouldn't happen? That violates morality. That violates ethics, right? To answer that, we have to look at theories of ethics, i.e., what is the difference between good and bad? And there's tons and tons and tons of these. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about them in the next section. But one of the ones I wanted to talk about first is moralism and causalism. Okay, moralism essentially says acts are either good or bad in themselves. What matters is kind of the intention of the person doing the thing, right? But then there's causalism, which says that acts can only be judged by their consequences, right? So it's not good or bad in itself. It doesn't matter what you intended. You have to look at the consequences of those actions to see whether it was good or bad, right? There was a guy who looked at gasoline in the early 20th century, and how people were adding, the gas companies were adding alcohol to the gasoline to kind of stretch it out. It still worked to run cars, but it was a lot cheaper to produce gasoline with alcohol in it than just gasoline by itself. And he figured out that you could add lead instead of alcohol, and that was even cheaper. So these gasoline companies all started adding lead, and his intention was to create this more economically efficient way to run cars. And of course, the outcome, the actual consequence of his decision was all this lead in the air and horrible, horrible pollution. And most of the world, or almost all of the world, has outlawed leaded gas, but it took, decades and decades for that to happen. So whenever somebody does something, do you look at what their intentions were? Do you look at the act and what that act was, or do you look at the actual eventual outcomes of that act, the consequences of that act? Okay. Next thing, human rights violations basically always involve the state, either directly or indirectly. And once again, I'm using the word state here in the kind of national, country political structure way. And it's almost all, it's even at the bare minimum, the state kind of knows about the human rights violation and looks the other way, right? So but even that is kind of involvement, right? So they basically, these human rights violations involve the state, even if they're not a direct actor, right? So what is the role of the state? What's their job? What's their purpose? What's, this government thing? What should they be doing? What should they not be doing? To talk about that, we have to talk about theories of politics, right? So Hobbes, who we talked about a couple slides ago, he was the humans are in a constant state of conflict dude. He says, look, we need a strong state in order to protect people from each other, from themselves, right? We need to have a king or some kind of strong figure or strong government group that is able to go in and say, hey, you don't steal, don't violate that other guy's property, all these things. But then, in the Enlightenment era, late 1600s, early 1700s, that kind of time frame, along comes these other three guys that were the original liberals. Okay, and I don't mean the word liberal the way it's used in the United States today to mean kind of left-wing, progressive, that kind of thing. Okay, I'm using liberalism in the term like philosophers use it, like it was used in history, which is much closer to what we in the United States would kind of call like a libertarianism. And there were these three guys, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and Adam Smith, who kind of all in roughly the same sort of time period said, look, it's not about the strong state. It's about, the government should only do enough to protect economic and voluntary transactions between the citizens. And it's their job to, whether we're talking about actual economic transactions or other kinds of social or cultural or emotional transactions, whatever, it's only their job to kind of make sure that the rules are followed. Right? That's it. That's all the government should be doing. And that is a picture of Locke there, who we'll talk a lot about, at least in the next chapter, but probably all through the course. But then, of course, Marxism, they look at government as, look, the government is just subsidiary to economic interests. You want to know how a government is going to run, look at the economic interests, because those are the ones who get to run the government. It's the economic power is above political power, and economic power controls political power. So really the state is just this tool that the economic elites use to maintain their power and exercise their power, right? Whoops. So last, human rights violations occur in spite of this civilization, right? We have these civilized countries, or what we kind of assume and think of as civilized modern nation states, and yet they're still committing lots and lots of these human rights violations. Like they're really common even today. I mean, I'm recording this in 2019, and they're all over the news. So what's the point of progress? What's the point of having a civilized society if it's not going to protect human rights? And to answer that, we have to look at theories of modernity. Okay, modernism, modernist, modernity. The liberals, again, using that not to mean the kind of left-wing progressives, but the old school version of liberal, they like to look at and apply with modernity this rational choice thing, which says that every decision everybody makes, they're weighing the benefits, the positives and the negatives, and they're choosing the choice which maximizes the positives and minimizes the negatives. They're making these decisions rationally. The Marxists say that it's all just kind of comes back to materialism, right? Modernity only gives us more things to buy, more products that we can buy and sell, and it's not necessarily that we're any better than we used to be. We're not any more civilized. We just have more stuff, right? We have these computers and cell phones and all these fancy gadgets, but really we're no more civilized than we were before. Critical theory is really a response to the liberal, rational people argument, and they say basically like, no, there's no rational system. I mean, look at 2019 United States. There's all kinds of contradictions to rationality you could point out, and it's these critical theorists kind of focus on, look, we're not rational. What are you talking about? Modernity hasn't brought rationality. We're still stuck in this day and age. We have just as many irrational contradictions in our political and social and economic system as we've ever had. So it's not that we're more civilized. We still have all these non-rational things going on. And then there's the post-structuralists who essentially say that this whole idea of progress and rationality are complete nonsense. Like, there's no such thing. We only tell ourselves we're rational because it makes us feel better. There's no such thing as rationality. It's all just made up. It's something that people can make themselves feel better with. It's this big story we tell ourselves in order to make ourselves feel better. But it's all nonsense, right? So we're going to be talking more about a lot of these things throughout the duration of this course. That's the end of section 1. I really hope that this is interesting for you. Please, 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 if you watch this far, please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat or in the response for this video. Thank you.